Hello, class. Today we're going to be discussing the European Enlightenment, and it's really important for us to understand about the Enlightenment period because it serves as kind of the intellectual basis for the American Revolution and for the French Revolution, which will come later. But we really have to understand that there's no way you can have an American Revolution or any of the founding documents like the Declaration of Independence or our Constitution without the European Enlightenment, because all the ideas that were embodied in those documents got their start during this time period. So what is the Enlightenment? It's also referred to commonly as the Age of Reason. The Age of Reason. And so it's an intellectual, political, and ideological and philosophical movement of predominantly the 18th century. Writers from all over Western Europe used to come and theorize about natural rights. And they were really looking to reform a lot of their political systems. Remember, at this time you had absolutism in Europe, so all the power in all phases of government was embodied by one person, being the king, and they were said to have the divine right of kings, which means that God gave them the power and the authority to rule. It was unquestioned, and no one could speak out against them. And perhaps this wouldn't have been so bad if the kings didn't abuse the power in the way that they did, so often. So a lot of these writers began to speak out, saying that, wait a minute, all men have natural rights, and that it is the role of the government to protect those rights. And so, again, as you see on the screen, many of the political ideals that we hold dear today were really first theorized by Enlightenment thinkers, Enlightenment authors. And these ideas will serve as the basis for some of the important revolutions that we see happen later in human history. Important vocabulary for us to know. Philosophes. So that word is just French for philosopher. And that's the name that was given to the Enlightenment thinkers. And we'll see that France really becomes kind of like the seat of the Enlightenment more so than any other country. France will turn out the most Enlightenment thinkers. And the salons were meeting spaces where the philosophes would gather, and they would discuss, trade their ideas. And what was really cool and important about these were that the salons were often sponsored by women, wealthy women particularly. They'd invite all these great Enlightenment thinkers and just kind of have a space for them to discuss their ideas. And it allowed women to take a role in the Enlightenment, which for the most part, you didn't see women taking roles in philosophical, intellectual movements prior to this in Europe. So this really gave, women access to some of the most powerful and prominent thinkers, and allowed them to start, thinking for themselves about their own freedoms and their own rights. And the having women host the salons is an often overlooked but very important part of how we got to women's rights and the idea of men and women being truly equal. And the social contract, that's a word that you'll hear here and there when talking about the Enlightenment. And basically it's the belief that an agreement is entered into by a government and its citizens. The citizens give power to the government, and in turn the government is to protect the safety and the rights of its citizens. You'll see in our Declaration of Independence that the phrase "the consent of the governed" is used, and that's really just another way of phrasing this same idea. And remember, because European kings thought their power came from God, and so therefore it could not be questioned. But this social contract challenged that whole idea by saying, no, your power comes from the people, and therefore we have the ultimate say as to whether or not you get to keep your power. That was a very radical idea for this time period in history. So these are some of the important Enlightenment thinkers. Voltaire, he wrote extensively on a lot of topics, but what he's most famous for is his somewhat anti-church sentiment, but really, in reality, he was more of a strong advocate for religious freedom, which most European countries did not have at the time. Either you were Protestant and forced to be Protestant, or you were Catholic and forced to be Catholic. And he thought that the the kind of killing and imprisonment of people based on the way that they choose to worship God was nonsensical, and that uh, a truly free society should have religious freedom. John Locke, who is an English thinker, he's known as the father of liberalism, and he's one of the early and most important Enlightenment thinkers. He's credited as one of several developers of the social contract theory, which we talked about in the last slide. And he's quoted as saying that all men are entitled to life, liberty, and property. Now, you might have heard the phrase before, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, which was written by Thomas Jefferson in the Declaration of Independence. Well, there's actually a lot of historians who would argue that Thomas Jefferson's writing of the Declaration of Independence and several other of his writings, by today's standards, would have been plagiarized or considered plagiarism of John Locke. So he's, really one of the big. John Locke is one of the big influences on one of our great founding fathers, Thomas Jefferson. Baron de Montesquieu, he's most well known for arguing that the government should be divided into three branches, one to create law, one to enforce law, and one to interpret law. And that's where we get our idea of separation of powers and the creation of our three branches of government, which we'll talk about in a little bit. But Baron de Montesquieu, although wrote about a bunch of topics, as did all of these guys, but he's most famous for really being the first person to vocalize the need for a separation of powers into three distinct branches. Jean-Jacques Rousseau, his most well-known work is a book called Emily, and it's a treatise on holistic education, really starting from young and training and educating children to be well-informed citizens and how to participate in their government. And his discourse on inequality is still read and discussed by political theorists around the world, as is Emily. He's his writings, perhaps more so than any of the others on this slide, are still read and discussed as some of the most important enlightened documents that have ever existed. Thomas Hobbes, considered another developer of the social contract theory, which he kind of lays the groundwork for in his book Leviathan, which really talks about the order of structure, the order and structure of government and society. And if you look at the dates of his life compared to some of the other people on here, you'll see he's really one of the earlier ones. And his book Leviathan is one of the earliest pieces of Enlightenment literature. And the last person on here is René Descartes. He's another Frenchman, and he was a philosopher and a mathematician who developed the Cartesian coordinate system used to chart graphs and equations. So you have him to thank for all those graphs of equations that you have to chart in math class. He was the first person to show that could be done on a graph. And his book Meditations on First Philosophy is still a standard text at a lot of colleges and universities when people want to study, whether it's philosophy or government or he's considered one of the founders of Western philosophy, and he's remembered for his extensive writings. So these are just some of the thinkers. There are many, many others who are very important in the Enlightenment, but these are some of the biggies that you should know. And together, taking bits and pieces from all of them, is how the United States arrived at its ideals that are expressed in the Declaration and in our Constitution. All right, so these people are very important for us to know and to understand what their lives' work was about and how it helped to develop what we come to think of as a modern day form of government.